think this issue of using the military to go after American citizens is one of those things I think is a very, very bad thing. Even to say it for political purposes to get elected, I think it's a very, very bad thing, let alone actually doing it.
We're crossing that line. Looks like we're actually doing it. It is the nightmare scenario, one in which the honorable men and women of the military, of our armed forces, at the direction of their commander-in-chief, start doing this, what Trump has threatened to do. Start going door to door, seeking out the so-called Trump-described, quote, enemy within, training their sights on the very people they swore to protect. Perhaps more likely, though, is a scenario in which Donald Trump uses a combination, a mishmash of any number of his powers, the Insurrection Act, the Alien Enemies Act, to deploy the military to round up non-citizens, or at least folks he believes to be non-citizens. Is that really so much more acceptable or permissible? Beyond questions of practicality associated with the military becoming a domestic policing force on American soil, like the fact that they're not trained to do that, there are questions of principle, ones laid out by General Randy Manner this week on Capitol Hill.
Involving the military in a politically charged domestic issue like mass deportation would erode public trust in the military. Americans trust our military because it protects all of us, regardless of our politics, from the possibility of foreign aggression. When the military is tasked with carrying out domestic policies that may be controversial to some, it undermines the foundation of that trust. That, in turn, will increase risks in morale, recruitment, retention, and readiness. And all of these impacts carry serious consequences for our national security. Gentlemen, for these reasons, and ladies, for these reasons, I strongly encourage any future presidential administration to keep immigration enforcement and our military separate.
Joining our conversation is retired Major General for the National Guard, Randy Manner. General, thank you so much for being here. Trump has indicated that this is very much on the table and going to happen. Your thoughts on what that will look like and feel like for the men and women of the military?
Well, as I said at the Senate Judiciary hearing on Tuesday morning, this is really going to have a negative impact on our national security relative to the readiness of both our regular military units, if they would be used, as well as the National Guard. Those people who have not served in the military may not understand that the National Guard only has 39 total days per year to train for their combat missions. And then secondarily, and equally as important, of course, is to respond to homeland emergencies such as hurricane relief or forest fires or earthquakes and so on. So 39 days to do all of that. Anything you take away from that will absolutely degrade the readiness of our national security.
In the first Trump presidency, there were men like General John Kelly and Secretary Mattis around Trump and his most aggressive immigration policy folks, people like Stephen Miller, who pushed back. It's clear that Trump plans to assemble a very different cast of people. Where inside the military would any resistance, either from a readiness standpoint or a moral standpoint or a cultural standpoint, come from?
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs is the advisor to the president on all matters of national security from a military perspective. So it would fall back to him to provide that advice and counsel. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military. So in the end, the president can make whatever call that he desires within the limits of law. Unfortunately, we've already seen the Supreme Court say that there are fewer guardrails on the office of the president than existed in years past. So this is something where there is a chain of command, and the principal person that would receive those directions and have, quite frankly, very pointed conversations would be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Former
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, did something extraordinary in the first Trump presidency, after being in Lafayette Square with Donald Trump, he made a video apologizing for being dragged into the kind of thing you're talking about, domestic politics, and being seen at that event. Can you just help us understand why it is such a line for the men and women of the military to cross, something that General Kelly spoke about it as well in an interview a few days ahead of the November election, why it is such a big deal and why it is so important to keep the men and women of the military out of domestic operations?
Again, people from every state and every community, every city, every town, every rural area have to understand that the United States military represents all of us. They come from all 50 states, the other territories, and the District of Columbia. They come from liberal families. They come from conservative families. They come, they're male and they're female. They come of all religions. And it's something where they come from different parts of the country, and they come together in many cases, not even having met people that are different from them in terms of where they may have been raised in their hometown or their city or their neighborhood. When they come together, and this is very, very important, the military takes them and replaces some of those ideas that they might have had that might have been biases for or against different people or peoples or ethnic groups or races, and instead replaces them with concepts of honor and respect of others. And this is something that is fundamental to the military, that the military supports all of us, not one particular political party or political viewpoint. The dilemma is that if indeed the military, whether or National Guard or military, is used for domestic operations other than disaster recovery, or for assisting on the border, quite frankly, for security at the border, that is a legitimate operation. Other than those kinds of things, it could obviously divide not only the military among those people who would support actively and privately, when I say actively, I say individually, not communicating. It was we're prohibited from communicating things when we're on active duty or in the reserve or the guard. But the idea is that it will divide the military into those that think it's a great idea and those who, quite frankly, don't, let alone those people in the community who may feel likewise.
Alicia, what is the implication in every sort of conversation that's come before this moment about immigration and Trump's promise for mass deportation?
I mean, something I want folks who, like us, are U.S. citizens to understand is if you live in community with people who are undocumented, if your house is on fire, you want them to be able to call law enforcement and ask for help and not be fearful for themselves that they will end up tied up in a situation. That is part of why you've seen sort of this separation where you do not want law enforcement that are not immigration law enforcement dealing with domestic situations, because it actually makes everyone in a community less safe. I think the other thing we need to talk about is just the number that's associated with this. You know, the reason that you're hearing so much from Homan, the reason that he is on cable news is because he does not need to go through a Senate confirmation, so he can go on all the right-wing shows and talk about what it is he wants to do, which means now you and I have visibility into what he's doing. He says it could cost $86 billion to carry out this deportation, but even he concedes that $86 billion is the minimum. A lot of folks think this will be closer to $1 trillion. And so, as we've talked about before, Republicans will try to move this through reconciliation. There will be a question if people like Tom Tillis, Susan Collins are willing to vote for something that is that large in order to do it. If they're not, what do they start doing? They start moving budgets around, right? They start taking money from CBP and moving it over to DHS so that they will have resources. You do not want what Trump talked about during the campaign, which is taking troops that are currently positioned abroad and moving them to the U.S.-Mexico border, right? You want to think about this in terms of a world of resources and how those resources are best deployed. Is the best deployment of those resources, is the best spending of $1 trillion in American tax money going after moms and dads who are trying to do better by their kids?
What do you think the vast majority of Americans thinks? I
don't think the vast majority of Americans are there at all. And I think when you start getting into
even the Trump voter, I don't think
the Trump voter, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think they talked about this as though they were going after criminal and violent offenders.
Right.
And that is very different than going after folks who have lived peacefully in this country for years, who have deep ties to this country.
Or American-born children.
And American-born children. You also had Holman, I don't know if you caught this because I wanted to ask you about this. You also had Holman saying he wants to set up a phone line for members of the public to alert immigration authorities to undocumented people in their communities. And can you imagine the racial profiling, the violation of civil liberties that happens if you can just call on someone who's walking down the street?
It's an invitation to racial profiling, and it will get totally out of control. But even the logistics of what he's talking about, he has not really laid out. Yes, it would cost $1 trillion, but you're going to deport them where? Do you have an agreement with the countries that they came from? How do you even know what countries they came from? So you're going to hire personnel to track down, do you come from Mexico? Do you come from Ecuador? I mean, the logistics of doing this is ridiculous because it will cost super money, take super time, and you have not worked out an agreement. You can't just put people on a plane and land in some other country's field without having clearance there while you're talking about tariffs against Mexico at the same time. So I think that if Trump's own supporters understood how loosely this was thrown together with no thought, they would have to say, wait a minute, and we're going to blow $1 trillion and really not be able to execute this.
Well, and just the idea of moving 11 million human beings. Are they on trains? Are they on buses? Who would they get off, and what happens?
And
to house them, for the babies? I mean,
to house them, who's going to pay for the housing? Who's going to guard them? Where's security? I mean, the enormous expense of this, I don't think anyone has realistically talked about it. He's just throwing things against the wall, seeing what sticks with his voters.
We know he does that. All right, no one's going anywhere. We'll all be back on the other side of a break. We'll ask this question: how are immigrants' rights groups preparing to push back against all of it? We'll look at that next. Everyone's back. General, let me start with you. What sorts of questions should be asked in the confirmation process of Mr. Hegseth that would, regardless of what the answers are, give some clarity to the men and women of the military about what their missions will be in this space?
I think a lot of this is going to have to do with just saying what does he envision in terms of the scope of the involvement of the military. Please remember that it is a legal and legitimate role to be helping to secure the southern border, or northern border for that matter, in terms of watching it, in terms of providing transportation and logistics. The challenge is if you increase the scope beyond what it is already, then it's going to start to impact our readiness to resist those that would do us harm around the world, whether it's the Chinese or the Russians, or whether it's taking away from our ability to strengthen our relationships with our allies, and of course to take care of our family members our service members and their families. So I think that asking questions about the scope of this and how that would be carefully managed would be absolutely critical. The idea that he is going to move rapidly, not only will it far exceed the resources that are already part of ICE or the Customs and Border Patrol, but it would obviously start to negatively impact, again, the readiness of the military. And that's where we have to think in a much more balanced way about what are the trade-offs for the national security of our country.
I mean, Trump is already adopting language that seems intent on getting ahead of that by describing it as an invasion from which the military has to protect us. People who are here illegally or who represent a threat, national security or otherwise, are already on a pathway to deportation, not citizenship. So what do you think, or what do you hear when he describes all of the people he'd like to deport? And the number is anywhere from 11 to 17 million from his own campaign surrogates, when he describes that as an invasion.
So I think it's very important for me to say that from where I sit, from my experiences, I really am fully capable of answering, obviously, questions on the impacts to our national security, the impacts relative to the civil rights of American citizens who might be inadvertently targeted, how the illegal immigrants may be collected and managed and moved and processed and so on. Those are issues that I don't have firsthand experience with. And that's also, by the way, part of my argument, that those responsibilities should be firmly in the hands of those that have received the training and the expertise to do it appropriately, fairly, respectfully, and effectively, so that no one is adversely harmed. So again, back to the military, the most important message I can say to each of you and to our listeners is the military should not be involved in actually handling or involvement directly with immigrants or people who are allegedly immigrants.
Retired Major General Randy Menner, thank you. We'll give Alicia and the Rev the last word on the other side. Don't go anywhere. Rev, you get the last word.